Welcome everyone to the Bandicoot talk with North Sydney Council's Bushland team. Our guest speakers tonight are Professor Peter Banks. A little bit about Peter. Peter is a Professor of Conservation Biology at Sydney University. Peter is one of Australia's top mammal ecologists and has been involved with the endangered long-nosed bandicoot population on North Head for over 20 years, studying their habit, use, behaviour and threats. This is the longest running bandicoot monitoring program in Australia. Much of his work now informs the management of population by New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and many of his former students have gone on to work at North Head. Peter is also an expert in the behaviour of Australian introduced mammals, particularly behaviours that allow native species to survive encounters with introduced predators such as foxes and cats. Great to have Peter here. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. And just a quick introduction to Catherine as well. Dr. Catherine Price is a postdoctoral researcher at Sydney University working with Professor Peter Banks and has been involved in the monitoring of North Head bandicoot population since 2012. Wow. She studied the urban portion of the North Head population for a number of years and has provided advice to Council and New South Wales National Parks and management strategies for the population. Her research examines foraging behaviour in native and introduced animals and how to protect native species from predators. And as I mentioned just before, we have Joan Reid representing Sydney Wildlife, a wildlife carer, to answer questions, and Gareth Debney, the Bushland Management Coordinator for North Sydney Council. I will now turn over to Peter to start the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Wow, it's amazing to have so many people here. I guess that's one of the things about this coronavirus thing, that everyone's learned how to use Zoom, and we get much bigger audiences of these sorts of events, and it's great to be here. Well, what I thought I would do is, I suppose, just kick off with talking about some of the work that we've been doing over the years, managing the population of long-nosed bandicoots at North Head. And so I've got a bit of a presentation and I'll share my screen, and hopefully everyone will be able to see that. So here we go. Oops. Hopefully everyone can see that okay.
Yep, we can, Peter, thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, bandicoots. I mean, you must know what bandicoots are. That's why you're here. They don't look anything like that. I don't know what was in their head when they decided to draw Crash Bandicoot looking like that, because of course they look like that. Why they're kind of interesting is that in terms of their taxonomy, they kind of sit in between the other groups of marsupials. So like the little carnivorous marsupials, they've got kind of cat-like teeth because they are predators, if you like. So they eat invertebrates and those sorts of things, and small vertebrates sometimes. So they're a lot like some of our carnivorous marsupials, but then they're also a little bit like our macropods in that they've got these fused toes. So these are this is a group of animals that there's not that many of them that sit between the two big groups of marsupials, and they're a pretty special group. Why they're really special in terms of a conservation sense is that of the 9 or so species that we've got, almost all of them are either extinct or dramatically declined on the mainland. So the pig-footed bandicoot is extinct, the desert bandicoot is extinct, the lesser bilby is extinct, the golden bandicoot is almost extinct, and so on. Most of the animals that are like this, that are about the size of a rabbit or so, have suffered dramatically since European settlement. Most of them have suffered a massive range reduction. And the threats are all the sorts of threats that we're concerned about in conservation: predation by introduced predators, changes in burning regimes, habitat loss. And they're a classic in what we call the critical weight range of animals at risk in terms of conservation. But weirdly, they like to live in our cities. And so all the major cities in Australia actually have bandicoots. So they don't have the ones obviously that have suffered badly, but there's a few species that do hang on. So Brisbane has northern brown bandicoots. Sydney has long-nosed bandicoots. Adelaide and Melbourne have southern brown bandicoots. Hobart has eastern barred bandicoots. And obviously they are popular with the public because there's 100 of you here tonight to hear about bandicoots. And it's amazing that species that have otherwise suffered so much since Europeans got here are somehow hanging on and living in our cities. So these are the sorts of questions that we've been trying to understand. How are they actually persisting in our cities? How can we help them persist? And we've been looking at that North Head population in particular. They are interesting to study for these questions because they are, it's odd that they're still living in cities, and they seem to be, we're trying to work out how they fit in with generally how cities affect wildlife. Urban areas create new habitats that create winners and losers. The classic winners are things like rats and mice and, of course, possums. The classic losers have been the macropods, and yet these bandicoots are somehow hanging on. So we've been studying the population at North Head for quite a while to try and understand what do they need to persist there. And of course, it encapsulates trying to manage a small population that's vulnerable. And that is, again, one of the big sort of conservation issues. How do we look after small populations of things and stop them going extinct? So the population at North Head, I still am amazed, even though we've been studying them since 1997, I'm still amazed that here at the opening of Australia's biggest city, we have a population of these mammals living and persisting. And well, as you'll hear, they're doing quite well. So they're living on 400 hectares of prime real estate, but they are still a small, isolated, and they have to be self-sustaining population. And they are actually listed still, I'm pretty sure, as an endangered population. So at North Head, they're occupying just that area that's above the suburbs of Manly. But Kat's going to talk a bit more about that. So it's quite bizarre that they have persisted at North Head, and probably one of the reasons why they persisted there was because that patch of land was isolated from Sydney for so long. Many of you would know that the quarantine station was there, and it was there to serve the purpose in the last global pandemic of isolating the rest of Sydney from people with Spanish flu getting into the city. And if that quarantine station was there to serve that purpose, to quarantine Sydney from things coming into the city, diseases, etc. It was isolated from the rest of Sydney, and that meant that a lot of the urbanisation effects of Sydney were also kept away. So it was a patch of land that really was undeveloped. There was a quarantine station built there, there was a seminary built there, and they created nice lawns for people to walk around, and this created wonderful habitat that the bandicoots really took to. They took to suburban living really well, as you'll see. But they nevertheless are endangered. They were the second population of species listed under the old Threatened Species Conservation Act, and they were listed because they were cut off from urban development, and they were a small population that had to be self-sustaining. So while the species is common enough up and down the coast, but they are nowhere more common than at North Head, I'm pretty sure. But although they're still common up there, this population at North Head was likely to go extinct because of all the threats of urbanisation. So they got the threats that were listed is that they get run over by cars, and they're not that road savvy. They are feeding, they're nesting on one side of the road, and they want to go over and feed on those lovely lawns, and they get run over by cars. They get eaten by introduced predators. Foxes get up to the headland periodically, once every 2 or 3 years. And when they get there, they can kill about 20% of the population of animals because they're not really super predator savvy. Although they might recognize them as a threat, they aren't able to cope with them as a threat. And they're at risk from introduced cats, Dogs can kill them as well, and North Head also has an awful lot of introduced rats as well, although we think that they probably coexist okay with rats. And if anything, they might actually be able to deal with the rats. Yeah, so we've been sort of trying to understand how do we look after this population when they're faced with lots of habitat modification. Because although that area was cut off for a long time from urban development, it's not isolated from urban development. People want to do things up there. It is a beautiful patch of land. It is very good real estate, I suppose, potential, and that potentially brings urbanisation into the Bandicoot's sanctuary. Maybe I'll skip that. So we've been studying them for, well, it's actually more than 12 years, I suppose. Research works, looking at Bandicoot breeding patterns, population trends, sources of mortality. There's been lots of EIS survey work that's gone on up there as well, that's taught us about the things that matter for Bandicoot population processes. But the population got listed in the year 2000, I think. And at that time, we really didn't know how many there were there. The key question was, well, how many animals are living in this population? And that was obviously an important question to answer, but not an easy one. We tried a whole lot of different ways to try and count how many there were, but in the end, because the population was sort of isolated and separate, we decided to try and catch all of them. So we set traps across the whole headland, and these little blobs here represent what a line of traps looks like and the area around which they're trying to catch animals. We set 43 transects, 258 traps, sampling open areas and closed areas to try and work out exactly how many animals are actually in this population. Because obviously, the smaller the population it is, the more at risk it is of going extinct. When we did that first population estimate in 2002, we only caught 64 individuals. 37 of those were adults, 27 of those were sub-adults. They were mostly less than a year old, or less than 2 years old. Some were probably more than 2 years old. They were certainly mobile, moving around, but they really did seem to like the open areas much more than the traditional heath type habitat that we might think bandicoots like to live in. We don't think we actually caught them all, but we thought we probably caught about 80% of them, given where we were able to put traps. And that meant that the population size was about 100. And what's interesting is that that's the number that the national parks actually, that the scientific committee estimated were there. So we had about 100 bandicoots. But of course, in urban ecology, it doesn't really matter how many in total you've got. What really matters is how many females you've got, and how many for a polygynous species, because they're the ones that produce the babies, etc. So we think that there were probably only about 35 or 40 adult females that were keeping this whole population going. So over the years, we've been studying a whole bunch of different things, trying to look at, well, where are these animals moving, what sorts of habitats they are interested in. We found some interesting trends in that we seem to catch male animals more in dense vegetation and catch female animals more in more open vegetation. That's a bizarre thing, that males and females are perhaps choosing slightly different things, but that does mean that maybe females like these grassy areas more so than males. We've done a bit of radio tracking, and Kath might speak more about some of her radio tracking work in urban areas, I'm not sure. But we were trying to work out, okay, do they really like these open areas so much, or how are they sort of using the landscape? We were putting radio collars on them to begin with, but because they're kind of wedge-shaped, they don't really have that much of a neck. And when we were putting the transmitters on in the early days, we thought that they were nice and snug on them, and then they just kind of shrug their shoulders and it'd fall off their snout. So we went to mounting them on their tails. And you can see here, this is the kind of area over which the bandicoots were roaming. If we catch them up at North Head, if you know the North Head area, that's the School of Artillery's parade ground where they filmed the Biggest Loser for many years. And this is the oval that's up the back of that. You can see the bandicoots. The light of the area is really where they're concentrating their activity. And no matter where we caught the bandicoots, they were really concentrating their activity around these grassy patches. So these are animals that we caught next to the grassy areas, and then these animals are ones that we caught away from the grassy areas, and they were still moving to those grassy areas to forage in. Because, as you probably know, they like to forage and stick their noses in grass to forage on nice soft grass, and I'll show you a bit more in a second. Yeah, so they're really preferring those open areas. We've been trying to work out, well, how far away from edges will they forage? What are the characteristics of grass that they like to forage in? So students have been counting their diggings in quadrats over the years and measuring things like soil moisture and hardness and how deep do they dig and how close to ground cover would they forage. We've done a few experiments where we've tried to see, well, is it the soil moisture that really promotes digging? And so we set up a little experiment where we treated a couple of quadrats with water by putting a sprinkler on and watered them for a couple of hours each day and counted the amount of digging activity. And you can see in this graph that they really loved when we watered the grass. If we made it nice and soft for them to dig in, they came and dug in it. So they really liked this nice soft grass to be able to forage in. So probably what's a little bit bizarre is that high quality habitat for these long-nosed bandicoots isn't the traditional heath that they probably evolved to exploit. It is the suburban grassland areas that they love to forage in, particularly where it's close to covered, particularly when it's well watered, and it's certainly not the sort of natural heath. And in fact, if North Head had no grassy areas, I doubt that the bandicoots would really persist there, certainly not in the numbers that they are there. But of course, sometimes these areas are under a lot of development threat, and it's weird that we think of these grassy areas as something that might be actually critical for this bandicoot population to persist. We've been sort of using this knowledge over the years then to try and work out how can we make sure that this population is sustainable in the future? How can we advise people on what to do or not to do in order to look after them and look after bandicoot habitat? So in the early days when people were looking, so this is maybe in the year, well, 1998, I guess, or even earlier, when they were looking at development applications for this kind of area, we were really just guessing what good quality habitat was for bandicoots. So this is from an early EIS, which was guessing what was good quality habitat. And it was really just a guess because we didn't have much data. But we know a lot more now what they use. They don't really use the cliff edge out at North Head. They really do like these sorts of grassy sorts of areas. Yeah, so I might just skip through that. So because there's a lot of pressure on the bandicoot population up there, we've been, as I said, trying to work out what do they need, what do we need to look after, what do we need to manage in order to make sure that they persist. And there's been, as I showed this before, lots of development over the years that have been about trying to, I suppose, make people use the area a lot more, but we don't want that to impact on bandicoots. Whoopsie-days. And a lot of this came to the fore, and a lot of the work was stimulated by the reuse of the quarantine station, because back in 1998, it was not being used very much at all. Vandals were getting in there and destroying it. This is the old hospital that was burnt down by vandals. At about the same time, the proposal was put forward to reuse the place. And so in terms of reusing that a hotel, one of the questions was, well, what is the impact on bandicoots and how do we actually manage that impact? And so any development that goes on, and I think this is probably true for North Sydney as well, populations of bandicoots are going to become endangered, just like the ones at North Head, if they lose habitat, if they get run over by cars, and if the population that we've got gets smaller. and of course if they're consumed by predators. And when it comes to managing the stuff that goes on at North Head, predation can be managed to some extent, but a lot of them have the potential to increase habitat loss, road kills, and make a small population even smaller. The way that we've managed this for North Head is using this thing called, population viability analysis, where we model what the population will do. We try and predict how it will respond to different management options, and we take into account the fact that not all years are the same. Bandicoots respond to variations in weather conditions. When it rains a lot, it makes the ground softer and bandicoots can forage a bit easier. So these models are able to take that sort of thing into account. And we use the basic data about the population, like how big is it, how many might live there, what's the death rate, what's their birth rate, and we play around with variables that might reflect different sorts of human impacts to try and understand what will happen. We simulate what the population might do 1,000 times or so with different types of random inputs, for example, for weather conditions. And we get a prediction of what the population might do. So this is the model from 2000 when we first did this, where we thought there's about 100 there. The population can go up and down from year to year by as much as 25%. They live for about 2 years. The adult mortality is actually pretty low until they reach about 2 years or so, but the juvenile mortality was really very high. They have about 2 or 3 young each time they have a litter, and they can have 2 litters on average a year. But if a fox gets there, there's a 30% chance of that happening every year, and 20% of those animals of the population is killed until the fox is actually caught. And when we put all that in, you can see that the population's not got a 100% chance of surviving into the future because it's a small population that's at risk. And so what we've done over the years is model different scenarios, like what happens if they lose habitat and the population gets smaller? What happens if we have lots of traffic around and there's more mortality running them over? What happens if we don't have foxes in the system? And we've used this sort of thing to tell us, well, if there's more bandicoots there, then the population's got a much better probability of survival here into the future. If we start to have increased mortality, well, then that can cope with that. If the population gets smaller though, and we have lots of adult mortality, the population is more or less doomed. And kind of this is what we know has happened to populations of bandicoots across Sydney, because they would have been widespread across Sydney many, many years ago. And so we've used this kind of information to inform how it should be managed. So for example, if there's no foxes getting up there at all, the population's got a very good chance of persisting in the future. So this sort of information's been advising people, control foxes as quickly as possible, don't have too many cars heading up to the site. Don't have too many cars heading up to the site, look after the carrying capacity, make sure that there's a lot of animals still in the population. I'll quickly finish and show that this sort of management action has been successful because these are the numbers over time. So back in 2000, hardly any animals were caught in that very first population census. But as you can see, the long-term monitoring that's gone on by national parks over the years has led to a steady increase in the population, such that the estimate now is probably closer to 200 than it is to 100. But I will leave it there and pass over to Kath, who's going to speak a lot more about her particular work in the urban environment, I think.
Thanks, Peter. If you unshare your screen, I'll share mine. And hi, everybody. Now, are you seeing the right one? No. Okay, is everyone seeing their slideshow?
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, Excellent, brilliant. Thanks so much for coming, everyone, or for zooming in, I should say. Yeah, I'm just going to follow on from Pete and talk a little bit more specifically, I guess, about the urban part of the population. So the monitoring program that's been done on the headland for 20 years has been just phenomenal, really, and we've learnt so much about the bandicoots, and particularly we've learnt that protecting adults is really crucial for the sort of long-term persistence of this population. But what we've known a lot less about is the animals that have moved kind of, or appear to have moved down the hill a bit and are living amongst this really urbanised area of what we call Eastern Hill, which is a part of Manly that runs from the Corso up towards North Head. And so we've been working with Manly Council for about 3 years to try and get a better handle on those animals and understand how they're persisting in that sort of urban environment, and hopefully get some clues as to how bandicoots are spreading into other areas of Sydney, like North Sydney, and I'm in East Lindfield and we've got bandicoots, and through the northern beaches as well. So it's a kind of very strange thing because urban areas are really risky. You have heaps of cars, and we know that roadkill is a really bad thing for a bandicoot. Obviously, you don't, if you're the size of a rabbit, you really don't stand much chance up against a car. And they're also full of domestic pets. And we know that foxes kill bandicoots. And that's a picture of my dog, so I'm not trying to demonise anyone with pets, and he would have taken out a bandicoot anytime if he came across one. So urban areas are really risky, and adult mortality is a big problem for bandicoots. So how do they persist here? But what we also, I guess, know is that gardens and urban areas can also have big rewards. So bandicoots love to eat the bugs and grubs and worms that are in the soil underneath lawns and grassy areas. We've seen on North Head that they really like these watered areas. And so perhaps it's this kind of balance of risk and reward that is kind of allowing us to understand a little bit about why bandicoots are found in these urban areas. So Eastern Hill is, so here's North Head. It's, as you can see, kind of like almost like an island in the entrance to Sydney Harbour. And the area that we have been looking at specifically is this area called Eastern Hill, which is this, and it's a really urban, pretty densely populated area. It's about 55 hectares. The population is about 5,000 people. There's lots of apartment blocks, there's lots of terraces, lots of semi-detached houses, but also some freestanding houses and some parks as well. But anyone who's driven up the road up to North Head trying to find a park will know that it's pretty crowded. You're not under any illusions that you're outside the city. We've known that there are bandicoots in this area probably forever, but really until recently we've just recorded their presence. So they're really just dots on a map, and this map shows where bandicoots have been recorded since the mid-90s in that Eastern Hill area, but we didn't really know much else about them. So with Manly Council, we wanted to try and understand a bit more about where the bandicoots were occurring in this area. Were they everywhere, or were they just patchily distributed at times? Who they were they males, were they females, were they juveniles, were they adults? And then try and understand a little bit more about the behaviour of animals in this urban area to get a bit more of an idea about how they're actually living there. So the first thing that we did was we wanted to replicate the monitoring that's being done up on the headland so we can compare our results. And so we set out these transects of cage traps at 16 different sites across the headlands. So each of those sites, we put 6 traps out in people's backyards and in their front yards and in parks. We trapped animals for 3 nights, checking the traps in the morning and in the middle of the night. And when we caught a bandicoot, we took it out, we sexed it, we weighed it, we took a tiny bit of genetic material from its ear, And we'd also microchip them so that we can identify individuals and find out if we're catching the same animals or if we're catching different animals through time. So what did we find? I'm not sure how well that map will come out on people's computers, but basically we found a fairly patchy distribution, but with most bandicoots caught up sort of the top of the hill adjacent to this area called St Patrick's Estate, which we've known from the bushland monitoring bandicoots really like, because it's lots of these grassy areas with lots of, but then there's some shrubs around it, and it's fairly well looked after by the people that live there in the Catholic Church. So there were more bandicoots up this end, and basically as you moved away down the hill, we caught fewer bandicoots, but we did find them right out to the extremities, so they were able to persist in right across this eastern hill area, but in a sort of patchy way. We specifically wanted to look at females, as Peter mentioned. They're sort of the focus. They're the most important, obviously, because they're the breeders. And their distribution was similar. So we had most females up the top in that boundary with St Patrick's Estate and the bushland areas, and often in these there were some parks up the top of the hill there. And then, but we did also catch females right down to almost on the Corso, but just not as many. And their distribution sort of is very similar to the overall distribution of the population, which makes sense because that's where juveniles are going to be dispersing from. If we look at how animals move through the urban area, it was quite interesting. It was mainly males that we picked up on different transects, so moving between transects within the 3 days that we trapped. So each of those polygons is a different animal, and within the 3-day trapping periods, we only ever really caught males that were on different transects. So you can see, and it was quite varied. There was one animal there, that huge green, I want to say triangle, but it's not really. And we caught him on about 5 different transects, and within 3 nights. So he was really going for a huge wander and covering almost the whole area, which of course puts these males at greater risk of getting hit by a car or coming across a predator. We also looked then at movements between trapping periods, so between November and March. And again, we really only found that it was males that were moving these larger distances. So that sort of green L-shaped wedge polygon is a male that moved sort of almost from the top right round out to that sort of extremity. The females we mainly caught just on the same transects. They tended to stick, once probably they'd established a territory, they stuck to those areas pretty tightly even through time. And what's interesting is that accords with what we find in the bushland, where females don't tend to move as much. They tend to occupy the kind of best habitat, if you like, whereas the males move over much larger areas. So the kind of ecology of the animals is similar in the urban areas to in the bushland. The bandicoot numbers in the urban area for the time that we were monitoring them fluctuated quite wildly, and we were quite worried in November 14 when we'd gone from just over 30 animals down to 8 in fairly quickly, really, and we thought maybe they were going to disappear altogether. But the numbers were able to bounce back relatively quickly, and I think they continued some trapping after this, and the numbers have increased. So the numbers probably in the urban area fluctuate more wildly than in the bushland because of the higher rates of mortality. But they are also able to bounce back. So that's interesting too. As you can see, there were more males than females, and that was fairly consistent throughout the time that we were monitoring the population. And that was quite different on the bushland. In the bushland, we were starting to see more females than males. So the population dynamics are slightly different in the urban area to the bushland. who are these urban bandicoots? Well, when we did monitoring in November, this graph shows the weights, and this is how we sort of look at the population structure. Any male over 650 grams, we term an adult, and any female over 450 grams, we term an adult. So in November, you can see we were mainly getting adults, and fairly large, healthy sized adults as well, which was good. And November's around the start of the breeding season, so we wouldn't expect to see many juveniles, but I think we hardly caught any at all. But then when we trapped again in March, which obviously is sort of more towards the end of the breeding season, we were getting animals much more evenly spread through those weight ranges. So a lot more juveniles had survived and were coming through. So I guess what we learned from that is that the timing of the trapping is going to matter in terms of what your population structure looks like. So what is different about the urban bandicoots? What is sort of going on with them that is different to these bushland creatures, and what can we, I guess, learn to help us manage urban bandicoots specifically? Well, it looks like they, and not surprisingly, suffer really high mortality. When we look at the animals that we catch from one trapping session to the next, we don't get nearly as many recaptures in the urban area as we do in the bushland. It's about half. So very unsurprisingly, we conclude that much higher death rate. Animals just don't survive for as long in that urban area. But they're persisting. And what we think might be sort of compensating is that they tend to have a longer breeding season. So when we trap in May on the headland, we won't catch hardly any females with pouch young. But when we trap at the same time, only a few hundred metres away in the urban area, we're getting about half of the females with pouch young. And for bandicoots, we know they're sort of a boom-bust species. When resources are good and food is good, the females can breed and they can produce litters quite quickly. They've actually got the shortest gestation period of any mammal. They're only pregnant for about 12 days. And the young are pretty much independent after about, I think it's about 50 or 60 days. So they can reproduce quite quickly when conditions are good. And I think that probably in the urban areas, they're able to exploit the kind of stable resources that people's gardens provide. So these are just some examples of places that we trapped that had breeding females and well-watered lawns, and this kind of stability is providing them with food year-round, and probably quite nutritious food compared to maybe in the bushland where things are drying out from time to time. So we also, when we were doing this work with Manly Council, we also did a survey of local residents to find out a bit more about what their gardens were like and how frequently they observed bandicoots. And one thing that was really striking was the people that had mulch in their garden were much more likely to see more than one bandicoot at a time. And they were also much more likely to see bandicoots more frequently. And so this got us thinking, well, maybe there's something about mulch that improves probably the food, a bit like having a watered lawn. Putting mulch down enhances the amount of water retention under the ground. And so we did a little experiment where we put out patches of native mulch, patches of pine bark, and then we also had some just grassed areas. And we monitored those with cameras to see what the bandicoots would do. And we basically, it was very wet during this experiment, unfortunately. So we didn't get much of a difference between the control and the native mulch, but we got a huge difference between the amount of foraging that bandicoots did in native mulch and pine bark. They really didn't go onto the pine bark hardly at all. And in fact, we had some videos where it looked like they were pretty much avoiding it. So we also, at the start of the experiment, looked for insects under the soil at the start and then after 2 weeks. And we also found that under the native mulch, that the insects that the bandicoots are looking for increased under the native mulch, but they actually decreased under the pine bark. So I think it's probably a response to food availability, and the bandicoots are searching and finding more food under the native mulch than they are under the pine bark. So just to close up and to finish up, I thought I'd just put up some recommendations for what I think might be useful if you want to have a bandicoot-friendly backyard. Good food, so well-watered lawn as much as you can in Australia during the summer, but having some, I guess, keeping your lawn alive. Putting native mulch on your gardens, having compost bins around, and avoiding insecticides. So anything that increases the amount of bugs and worms and beetles and things like that in the soil. But you also need to provide some safety. And bandicoots nest in sort of dense shrub layers, so things that are dense like these lomandras, and provide them with some protection somewhere where they can run and hide and keep away from predators if they're around. Obviously, if you've got cats and dogs, keep them inside at night. And for councils, I guess, trying to have signs up that make people aware that there might be bandicoots around so that they slow down. But the other thing that's really important is if there are bandicoots around and you want them in your backyard, to have access. So Manly Council insists that people have access in their fences in this area on North Head, and that works quite well. Just a little hole or something that the bandicoots can get in, because you can have the best habitat in the world, but if the bandicoot can't get in, they can't get in. So my sort of summary is, I think that food probably decides where the bandicoots live, but at the end of the day, it's whether or not they're safe that decides whether or not they'll persist in an area. So thank you very much. I thought I would just attempt to show you a video of a bandicoot foraging around while we opened up for questions. So I can... And this is actually filmed in my backyard around my compost bin. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Oh, great, Catherine. Sorry, that was great, Catherine and Peter. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I found that really interesting, and I might not have set the context for having introduced asked Peter and Catherine to come tonight. If anyone is a subscriber to North Sydney Council's Bushcare newsletter, they would have seen in the last edition that we had bandicoots on our border with Lane Cove Council. And in recent years, from 2013, 14, 15, we've had them on the boundary with Willoughby. So not knowing much about these animals as they just returned to the area, we wanted to go to the experts to find out, what's going on with bandicoots in Sydney. And Catherine's presentation there at the end really helps us a lot with the management of these animals in our reserves. I'll now open up the chat so you can ask questions, and I'll read them out and ask our presenters to answer them. So we should all see chat on. Do we all see chat on? Yes. How come I'm not seeing chat on? Okay. Does anyone have any questions they would like to put to Peter or Catherine? You can type in the chat box. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you just scroll over the toolbar at the bottom, you'll see the word chat with a little bubble, and you can turn on that function and type in a question there. Maybe one of, can someone test it to see if it's working? There's no chat. Guys, is the chat working? Yep. Oh, great. Okay, it's working. We've just got a lot of shy people. Do Bandicoot sing? I'm just going to, I'll unmute both Peter and Catherine so you can answer these questions. Peter, I'm trying to unmute you. Catherine's unmuted.
They don't really sing, but they've got that bizarre little honk noise that's their anti-predator noise when they get scared by something. Maybe you've heard it. It's really quite pathetic in terms of scaring away predators, unless they're going to laugh so much they forget to chase. But it's it sounds like a squeaky toy honk. Yes, gosh, there's lots and lots of questions.
Yeah, there are. I guess we won't be able to answer all of them, but we'll just maybe answer the most important ones, or what you think.
Do they breed with only one male? In their lifetime, no. They're polygynous. I don't know for sure about whether or not one male different males can sire in the same litter. I'm not sure about that, but certainly they'll mate with different males for sure. The extent of bandicoots across the Greater Sydney area, yeah, that's really interesting. They were really just at North Head, like up until, say, 10 years ago, just really at North Head, and then the northern extent. But they do seem to be a bit like maybe the brush turkeys returning to the city, because they're over at Bradley's Head and that kind of area, and now they're extending through they're in North Sydney Council. So that, you know, they would have been once common everywhere. I know my dad had them when my parents lived in Epping, I think. Yeah, and he was scared of them. That was like in the 1940s. Too scared to go out in the backyard because he was worried about bandicoots biting him. But they obviously disappeared, but they're on the march back.
Yeah, I grew up in Chatswood, and we definitely didn't have them when I was growing up, but they're there now through Lane Cove National Park, and sort of extending out of the areas there. So into Ryde, we've had them on camera there now. So yeah, they're quite their distribution's quite broad now, really, through northern Sydney anyway.
Yeah,
Toxoplasmosis is really, if they get the sexual phase, so like they eat near a cat scat that's been shedding toxoplasmosis, they can die really quickly from it. But I don't know about the incidence in wildlife in bandicoots in general. They do sort of coexist where there are cats, but if they get it, the sexual phase, I know that it can be quite fatal to them. But I don't know that there's been surveys looking at the incidence of toxo in them.
Peter, Flo, my workmate, was just pointing out there's a few questions that some children have, or parents have asked on behalf of the children. One from James Marshall there. Can you see that? Can you tell us a bit more about Bandicoot's diet? My son is giving a talk at his school.
Yep, so they're sticking their nose in the ground to get the invertebrates that are in the ground. So the grubs that Kath showed before, beetles, larvae of different things, but they also eat fungi. So, the truffles that exist in, well, all we could do this, truffles. So the fungal bodies that are in the soil associated with fungi, they'll be eating those, and they're well renowned for spreading that around. They'll eat vertebrates, so small vertebrates. If they come across a skink, the skink will be in trouble, etc. Yeah. So, do you know anything more, Kath, about the diet?
No, I think that they're kind of a bit of a generalist, really. They'll eat, I think they'll eat seeds and bulbs of plants too. But then we've also had records of them and people saying they'll eat cat food and dog food that's left out of backyards as well. So I think they kind of eat whatever they come across that they can fit in their mouths.
Catherine, do you know if they eat fungus at all? I've heard people say, yeah.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fruiting bodies of fungi underground, they'll eat those. So they're the truffles. Yep.
There's another question by Astrid Hicks. My 8-year-old junior zoologist would like to know, why were there less females found? Whose study is she talking about?
Well, the sex ratio is so that is the ratio of males to females is pretty stable through time. I don't know. Did you find more females?
In the urban area, we find more males, and I suspect it's because the males will kind of roam down and across through areas that aren't such good habitat, whereas the females tend to stick just in those areas where they have the good breeding habitat, the good lawns, whereas the males roam further afield. So I think in urban areas, you're probably likely to get more males roaming around, whereas the females kind of fill the good habitat more quickly in a sense. But on the headland, we now catch more females than males, so the sex ratio's flipped over in recent times, and then I think in the last survey it's heading back to kind of even. So it does change through time. I'm not sure exactly.
The animals can adjust. They do adjust to what's called the operational sex ratio. So if there's more males in the population, females will adjust somehow their litter to start to produce the rarer sex. Here's a good question here. How do you differentiate a rat from a bandicoot at night? That's a cool question, because bandicoots are actually named after Bandicoota, the Indian rat, because the Europeans that first spotted them thought that they looked like the Bandicoota rats from India. But of course, they don't look anything like it unless... Actually, I've been up to North Head and I've heard the tourists sitting up there. I was listening to some Swedish tourists saying, look at the giant rat, when they were pointing to a bandicoot. But I reckon it's the tail length for me anyway. So I don't know if you can see, I've got a stuffed one here. Really short tail. It's only about that long. Whereas on a rat, you'll see a nice long tail, which will be longer than its body, particularly in these sorts of areas. It'll be longer than its body. And they're also 2 or 3 times the size.
I was going to say, they're massively bigger. If I saw a rat the size of a bandicoot, I'd be freaking out. But a juvenile, a young bandicoot can easily be mistaken for a rat. They're about the same size.
But this is a rat. So this is a black rat from the same area. And, the nose isn't anywhere near as pointy. The ears are not anywhere near as pointy. And it's got a really long tail. And I don't want to say that it looks more ratty, but I suppose that's the question. For me, rats obviously look like a classic rat, whereas bandicoots are so different.
Do bandicoots, there was a few questions about what bandicoots live in, burrows, mounds. Do bandicoots live in a hole? So they don't dig a hole like a rabbit does. They just make a nest in kind of grassy, thick grassy areas. They build a little grassy nest, but they also, which we didn't know until recently, they seem to go in and nest under buildings. And I think that's possibly also one reason why they've been able to succeed a bit better in the suburbs than we would have thought. But yes, they don't go down a hole like a rabbit does.
There are accounts of them being 2-3 stories up in apartments in Manly, isn't there, Kath?
Really? I have.
Yeah, Rachel had them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were climbing up the stairs, getting into the house.
I thought I'd just might take the opportunity to ask people if they had any questions about wildlife rescue or care, if they find injured wildlife, and also anything about bushland management in North Sydney Council related to bandicoots. For instance, fox control. Gareth could easily answer those questions. Maybe I just might I'll just ask Joan whether she might just like to tell us a little bit. Joan Reid, who I introduced at the start of the talk, looks after has cared for bandicoots, and maybe Joan, you could share with us some of your experiences, and that might get people asking a few questions.
Hi everybody. It's just like you were saying, roadkill's a big one. Cats, dogs, cats especially with the young ones that we get them brought in. I guess if you find a bandicoot that's got pouch young and the mother's dead, I would suggest, if you can, to wrap the whole thing up in a towel and take it to a vet, or call a carer and see if you can get a carer there quickly. But you know, you need to keep the babies warm and, you know, comfortable until we can get them. Any other questions? We tend to try and raise them and then rehab them, rehabilitate them so that they know what to catch, the natural foods and all that sort of thing. And when they're building their nests, as you call, then we can release them back into the wild. But it's no use releasing them until they know how to build their nests and, you know, catch all the proper food. Are there any questions on sort of that, or what? If anybody wants to know anything specific, I'm happy to answer.
From Leslie, there's a question from Leslie. I can't see it. Am I muted? If bandicoots come into care, how important is it that they are relocated in the same place they were found?
We always try to do that, and that's why it's really important to get all the information that when somebody takes it to a vet and that. There were some we got from North Head that were taken back to North Head that we hand raised. It's all very important in my ideas anyway, that they go back to where they came from. Not exactly that area, because as you say, they do roam in that, but in a suitable area close to where they came from.
Yeah, there'd be a legal obligation too, right, Joan? I think there is with
national parks. We have to, Sydney Wildlife has to follow National Parks rules and regulations on code of ethics, and there are rules and regulations for every species on how far we can put them from where we found them.
Joan, your work, how do you fund that work that carers do at Sydney Wildlife?
Sydney Wildlife's 100% volunteer organisation, so it's all on donations.
Right.
So yeah, and all your donations obviously go to the animals because it's not going to wages. So yeah, we're fully donated, fully run on donations and volunteer work. So,
yeah. But if people wanted to help out there with rehabilitation of bandicoots or other wildlife, how can they do that?
They can either join Sydney Wildlife. I'll put up in the chat our
actually, Flo's done it already.
Oh,
there you go. It's in the chat.
Thanks,
if anyone
Flo.
wants to help out, you can.
Thanks,
that's
Flo.
where they go.
So yeah, they can become a member. They can donate. There's a lot of ways, and even if you're a member, you don't have to. A lot of people don't want to do the animal side of it, but we have a lot of other things like answering our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week rescue hotline where people ring in to find somebody to rescue any of the wildlife. There's lots of ways you can help Sydney Wildlife.
Oh, that's great. Might I ask just Gareth to, thanks for that, Joan, much appreciate your input. I'd just like to ask Gareth if you could maybe tell people how North Sydney Council is trying to control the threats to bandicoots and other wildlife?
Thanks, Andrew. So North Sydney Council tries to approach this in a number of ways, one being directly through predator management. So we are part of the Sydney North Region fox baiting program, which occurs twice a year across national parks and a number of council areas. So that's important in trying to reduce the amount of fox predation that occurs. People are probably not aware, a lot of people anyway, that foxes are everywhere through our environment. They're not just in bushland, they're not just in regional or rural areas, they are everywhere. So it is important for urban conservation that we keep a handle on the numbers of foxes. We try to manage cat predation through the declaration of wildlife protection areas, which we have done in these core bushland reserves that host bandicoots in North Sydney, as well as other species. And in those reserves, we're able to trap and remove feral cats and try to educate our local community around responsible cat ownership and how to be a responsible pet owner. And then all of our programs focused on habitat improvement and species diversity and improving the quality of our bushland reserves, our urban bushland, and importantly, creating green connections and corridors between our bushland reserves. That ultimately is the key for the healthy survival of our bushland reserves. So we do that through a number of ways, but one is an urban home habitat gardening program called Native Havens that anyone in North Sydney can get involved in, whether you live close to bushland or not. Every little bit helps.
I've got answer to some questions. There's a question about the ethics involved in trapping. Yes, we are very sensitive to that. The main trapping that gets done for them is when they're not breeding. So it's the main trapping for them. National Parks does now is in May, and that's outside of the breeding season. If trapping gets done at any other time, the traps get checked twice a day to make sure that we capture and release any females that might have young. So no, we're definitely very, very sensitive to that. We don't want to make any population smaller. There was another question. Is genetic analysis about the populations that are around? That's happening, well, that's happened just now. And I will hopefully find out what's going on with all the different bandicoot samples that have come in pretty soon. It was an honours student project. I don't know if you know the results, do you, Kath? Yeah, so I guess we'll find out soon. It was an honours student that was done. It wasn't one of my students.
Yeah, I think from memory, I did see the results, and the North Head population was quite different, or was different to the other Northern Sydney ones, but the other sort of probably like North Sydney bandicoots in that area are more related to the Northern Beaches bandicoots. From memory, there was sort of more similarity between the rest of Sydney and North Head was a bit separate.
There's another question here about no activity at all to very high activity concentrated in and around ground irrigation, with the holes getting progressively larger. Yeah, that does sound like bandicoots. They do tend to dig out the holes. But what we've found with surveys that have been done over the same patches through time is that they harvest all the animals probably that are in the patch, or all the stuff that they can eat, and then they don't come back for a while. So there was a long-term study of monitoring done at the quarantine station, monitoring digging activity. And that's what they found, that the bandicoots would come to a patch and probably dig in it, but when it wasn't giving much, they would stop coming there for a while. So you might find that they'll stop coming around for a little while, and then they'll possibly let it recover a bit, and when whatever's in there that they want to eat comes back, then they'll be back.
Yeah, and they can dig quite, I've seen videos of them, I wouldn't have believed it, with their whole head down. Yeah. Down. You know, they can dig quite big diggings. You know, we normally think of them as sort of the size of a coin, kind of nose poke sort of size, but they can, if there's something that they really want, they'll keep going in and they get their front paws in and they get their head right in there. So some diggings can be quite large.
There's a question from Brad here saying, why have we not stated other major factors or omitted them for decline across Sydney? Not quite sure what you're thinking of, but the reasons why they probably declined is, you know, being run over by cars and eaten by pets, and there's not been enough habitat for them. I think that's probably what's gone on in the past, but what's the real puzzle now? Why they're able to be coming back now? Which is a really good question. We do know that from other work that we've done that they do avoid backyards that have got pets, in particular dogs. We've done a couple of these studies now. And so they are clever enough to avoid yards or at least not go into them quite as often where there are pets, particularly dogs. They don't seem to respond quite so much to cats, but they do seem to recognise dogs. And it's not surprising because they're hunted by dingoes, and dingoes have been here for 4,000 years. So that's probably they're savvy enough for that, but it might be a little bit different when they're trying to outrun a fox or outrun a cat. I'm not sure. Kath, do you want to speak about the population in Dulwich Hill?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting sighting that someone's reported, that there was a family of 7 with young in the pouch 7 years ago. We also did some work along the light rail line, trying to see if bandicoots were using that area in the inner west. And we got lots of foxes, we got heaps of cats, but unfortunately we didn't get any bandicoots at that time. And the only records we got from the community were from some years previously. So we're really not sure how many animals there might still be in that area. I mean, as you would have heard Peter talk about, a small population is just really hard. It's hard for a small population to persist when there's so much predation pressure on them. But I know national parks would be really interested if anyone has any recent evidence of any of those inner west bandicoots. They would love to see it because, yeah, I think we're really kind of, the status of them is pretty unclear at the moment. But that's interesting if someone poisoned them. Unfortunately, I guess a lot of people would think they're rats if they didn't know in that area, because you just wouldn't be expecting to see a bandicoot. So that's really sad.
Catherine, if people do have sightings of bandicoots, where can they report that information?
If they're in, probably to their local council would actually be the best thing. If they're in the inner west, to the council. I know the council has a Facebook page, and I think they have a survey up on their website. But also perhaps to national parks. If you want to send it to me, I can pass it on as well. If you're in other parts of Sydney, probably your council is the best place.
Yeah. I guess it's a bit of a leading question too. Like, we would be interested to know about bandicoot sightings here and register. We would register that data with the ALA, the Atlas of Living Australia. Yeah, we also do it with Bionet too.
I'm not sure if members of the public can enter data onto that. That's if it goes through council, there's a better chance of getting on there.
Yeah, and you can do that. You can also submit observations of any animal through their BioCollect app. So if you go to ALA, you'll see that and register your observations.
There was a question about the term bioturbator, which is applied to bandicoots because they do turn over the soil. They turn over a lot of soil. There's been some interesting stuff that's just come out from Western Australia about another species of bandicoot over there, about bandicoot's role in suppressing fire, because they turn over so much soil and turn over so much litter, that they may play a role in suppressing fire, which is kind of cool. But they don't dig tunnels. That's another question. They're not like moles, even though maybe they look a bit like them. It'd be a very big tunnel if they did. Probably be a trip hazard. No, they don't dig tunnels to go through the ground. No, they're just little. Well, they can get big, but they're little poke holes. Really, that's what we call them. So they're only about You know, that's a deep one if it was that big. But is it a good idea to create gaps in fences to allow them to move around? Yeah, that's the advice from Manly Council, to try and keep things connected where they can perhaps move through safer areas than going out on the roads.
Well, I think that our talk's been going for an hour and a quarter. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot from everyone. I think that's, what do you think, guys? Wrap up here. Maybe if there's any other questions, I could possibly have them answered at another time. Is there anything else you think you'd like to answer there, Peter or Catherine, before we close up?
I was just going to comment on the one in Greenacre. If that lady could email me, that would be great. Because I spoke to a woman who knew, I think, of that record when we were doing the monitoring, and as far as I know, it's not on any of the official records, but a Bandicoot in Greenacre would be really interesting to have put on the official records.
What was found here at the university at the not that long ago.
Wow.
We don't know really how it got here, but it was I didn't see it, so hopefully it was a Bandicoot, but it was reported as being one on the tennis courts here. That was probably about 6 or 7 years ago.
How do people get in contact with you, Catherine?
I'll just put my email up on the chat.
I can probably forward details as well after to everyone that's registered through Eventbrite, because I'll have all your emails. Okay, well, there's Catherine's email. Anyone wants to report the sighting in Greenacre? Well, I'd just like to thank Professor Peter Banks and Dr. Catherine Price for your presentation tonight. It was really interesting, and of course North Sydney Council's, our team here, are really interested to know more about bandicoots who are returning to our area. And of course, thanks to Sydney Wildlife being there. You do such a great service to the community. For us, we divert all our calls straight to you. Hey, Bev, what can we do about this? Can you come and help? And yeah, and so I encourage everyone to support them, because that they do the bulk of the work there with any animal rescues. And just like to thank my team, Gareth and Flo, for helping with our team's very first Zoom conference and webinar, and I'll bid you all good night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.